common trend I want to highlight concerns an historic challenge facing the global energy system. As you know, low-carbon energy, shown here in orange, has increased significantly in recent years, boosted in particular by wind and solar power, which has almost doubled since 2018, accounting for a third of the growth in primary energy, causing emissions to rise less quickly. But low-carbon energy is not yet growing sufficiently quickly to keep pace with increases in overall energy demand. As a result, the consumption of unabated fossil fuels used without capturing and storing their emissions, is continuing to increase alongside the growth in low-carbon energy. You can see that in the grey bars here. The world is in what might be called an energy addition phase of the energy transition, in which both types of energy, old and new, unabated fossil fuels, low-carbon energy, are both growing. And we see previous examples of energy additions in history. In the mid-19th century, when coal grew rapidly and supplanted wood and other biomass as the world's primary energy source. And roughly 100 years later, when the rapid growth of oil meant it overtook coal as a dominant energy form. In both those previous periods, the world remained in the energy addition phase, consuming similar or growing amounts of the old energy, even as it adopted the new. The world has never reduced its consumption of any fuel on a sustained basis. It's just consumed more of everything. And that's the historic challenge facing the global energy system. If the world wants carbon emissions to fall, it can't remain in the energy addition phase indefinitely. The energy system needs to move from energy addition to energy substitution, in which the growth of new energy, in this case low carbon energy, exceeds the increase in total energy demand, causing the old energy, unabated fossil fuels, to decline. The common trend is that this historic shift from energy addition to energy substitution happens in both scenarios, albeit with different timing and intensity. In current trajectory, the energy addition phase continues in the 2020s. You can see in the 2020s as a whole, the growth of low carbon energy increases even more, but still not enough to meet all of the growth in energy demand, and unabated fossil fuels, shown here in the black bar, continues to rise. That changes in the 20s and 30s and 40s as we start to see unabated fossil fuels start to decline. But the extent of this energy substitution is relatively limited. Unabated fossil fuels still account for 2/3 of primary energy in 2050, compared to a little over 80% today. The shift to the substitution phase in net zero happens sooner and with greater intensity. The energy system moves into energy substitution in this decade. You can see those black bars already falling in the 2020s, and then gathers pace in the 2030s and 40s, such that by 2050, the share of unabated fossil fuels in primary energy declines to just 15%. Two factors underpin this quicker, more pronounced shift to energy substitution. A sharper acceleration in energy efficiency, dampening and eventually reducing the world's overall energy needs, and even faster growth in low-carbon energy. The source of this increase in low-carbon energy, and the second common trend I want to highlight, is a rapid growth in electricity powered by wind and solar. Electricity demand increases between 75% and 90% in current trajectory in net zero. Most of this growth, around 80% or so, occurs in emerging economies as living standards improve and access to electricity increases. This growth in power demand happens alongside an increasing electrification of the energy system. And you can see that in this chart here. So today, just a little over 20% of the world's final energy demand is electrified. That increases to a little over 35% by 2050 in current trajectory, and to over 50% by 2050 in net zero. Over 50%. more than half of the world's energy use is electrified. This increasing role for electricity is reflected across all end uses, industry, transport and buildings, as more and more of our everyday processes and activities are electrified. The growth in power generation is matched, or more than matched in the case of net zero, by the rapid expansion in wind and solar power, shown here by the blue bars on the right-hand side, with the share of wind and solar in global power generation increasing from close to 15% today to between 50 and 70% by 2050. It's this growth of wind and solar power which is driving the increase in low carbon energy and the move to energy substitution in the two scenarios. The surge in wind and solar power is underpinned by continuing cost reductions, especially over the first 10 to 15 years of the outlook. Although necessary, these cost reductions are not sufficient on their own. The rapid expansion of renewable power requires wind and solar capacity to be deployed more quickly than ever before. That's possible only if a number of other enabling factors, grid infrastructures, planning and permitting, social acceptability, scale at a corresponding pace. It also requires power systems to bolster their resilience to the increasing variability of power generation as the importance of wind and solar increases. Some of that enhanced resilience is achieved by greater demand-side flexibility, with demand incentivised to match fluctuations in generation. It's also met on the supply side by growing amounts of battery storage, gas and coal-fired generation combined with CCUS and low-carbon hydrogen. The significance of these supply-side measures doesn't derive from the volume of the energy they provide, which is pretty small in both scenarios. Rather, their significance derives from the value of being able to provide energy on demand as and when needed. Resilience is a value game, right time, right place, not a volume one. The third common trend I want to highlight is for oil demand, which declines over the outlook in both scenarios, although as you can see, the speed and extent of that decline varies quite significantly. In both scenarios, oil continues to play a major role in the global energy system over the first half of the outlook, with the world consuming somewhere between 80 and 100 million barrels a day of oil in 2035. As you can see here, in current trajectory, the profile for oil demand is pretty flat over the first half of the outlook, with a level of oil demand in 2035 pretty much exactly in line with the level of oil demand today. And then we see a gradual decline over the second half of the outlook, with the level of oil demand reaching around 75 million barrels a day by 2050. In contrast, the pace of decline in net zero is far quicker, with oil demand falling to between 25 and 30 million barrels a day in 2050. That's around 70% below the current levels of demand. The single biggest cause of this decline in oil demand is the falling use in road transport, shown here in the yellow bars. This is initially driven by the improving efficiency of the global vehicle fleet. Further out, there's a growing impact from increasing electrification of cars and trucks. The number of EVs increases to between 1.25 and 2 billion by 2050 in the two scenarios, with the amount of oil used in road transportation falling from a little over 40 million barrels a day today to between 5 and 25 million barrels a day by 2050 in the two scenarios. So three trends which are common across both current trajectory and net zero. Trends which might occur in other pathways which lie somewhere between these two scenarios. The energy system makes a historic shift from energy addition to energy substitution. There's a sharp acceleration in low carbon energy led by wind and solar, and the demand for oil begins to decline. There are significant differences in the timing and magnitude of these developments, but the underlying trends are common to both scenarios. I want to switch now to features of the energy system which are more differentiated across the two scenarios, more dependent on the speed of transition. And the first is the outlook for natural gas. Now, we don't know much about how the energy system will evolve in the future. But I think for most fuels and energy vectors, we at least have a pretty good idea about how the level of demand in 2050 will be relative to today. So oil and coal, lower. Wind, solar, electricity, biofuels, low carbon hydrogen, all higher. But that's not the case for natural gas. In natural gas, in current trajectory, natural gas demand increases over the whole of the outlook, such that it's around 20% higher in 2050 relative to today's level. But in contrast, in net zero, natural gas increases in the near term, but then starts to fall away, such that by 2050, it's around half its current level. These contrasting outlooks reflect the impact of two competing forces. The dominant factor in current trajectory is the increasing use of gas in emerging economies as they grow and industrialise. In contrast, in net zero, natural gas demand is crowded out as energy systems around the world increasingly electrify and the share of wind and solar in power generation increases. These two opposing forces are operating in both scenarios. In current trajectory, increasing demand in emerging markets dominates. In contrast, in net zero, that's swamped by the growing electrification and the increasing role of wind and solar. Given that much of the growth in natural gas in emerging economies is met by liquefied natural gas, LNG, it follows this uncertainty concerning the future level of natural gas demand is also reflected in uncertainty about the level of LNG trade, which you can see here in current trajectory increases by about 80%, where in contrast, in net zero, it falls by around 40%. That range of possible outcomes for LNG, both up and down, adds to the uncertainty associated with investments in LNG facilities, which have long economic lives.